the fastest way to misjudge someone is to mistake their silence for weakness. Lunch hour inside Redwood State Correctional Facility always sounded the same. Plastic trays slid across stainless steel counters. Conversations echoed beneath high concrete ceilings. Correctional officers scanned the crowded cafeteria with practiced attention, and hundreds of inmates settled into routines that rarely changed from one day to the next. On that afternoon, however, an unexpected silence would settle over the room so quickly that even the kitchen staff paused for a brief moment. Marcus Reed carried his lunch tray with steady hands as he walked through the crowded dining hall for the first time. At 38 years old, the new black inmate appeared remarkably ordinary. His orange prison jumpsuit fit neatly, his movements were unhurried, and his expression revealed nothing except quiet awareness. He glanced across the room only once, calmly noting the occupied tables, the correctional officers positioned near the exits, the security cameras mounted above the serving line, and the narrow aisles separating each section of the cafeteria. Then he continued walking without drawing attention to himself. Most new arrivals looked nervous during their first meal. Marcus did not. He simply looked observant. That small difference was enough to attract attention from people who spent every day studying newcomers. Near the center of the cafeteria sat Kyle Donovan, a white inmate whose reputation had spread through every housing unit long before Marcus arrived. Kyle enjoyed controlling the atmosphere around him without raising his voice. A nod from him could invite someone to sit down. A glance in another direction could leave an empty seat untouched for the rest of the meal. Several white inmates laughed at one of his stories while others quietly watched the room, making certain nobody ignored the invisible rules that had developed over the years. Kyle noticed Marcus almost immediately. The newcomer neither searched desperately for approval nor avoided eye contact. Instead, he carried himself with calm confidence that did not resemble arrogance. That composure bothered Kyle more than open fear ever could. He leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly before picking up a paper cup filled with fresh coffee. Several inmates sitting nearby recognized the look on his face and slowly stopped talking. They had seen that expression before. It usually meant someone was about to become the afternoon's entertainment. Marcus continued walking, seemingly unaware that dozens of eyes had begun following him across the cafeteria. An older inmate named Walter Hayes quietly lowered his fork and watched with concern. Walter had spent nearly 18 years moving through different correctional facilities, long enough to recognize moments that changed the atmosphere inside a prison. He studied Marcus carefully. The new inmate walked with relaxed shoulders, steady breathing, and measured steps. Nothing about him appeared forced. Walter could not explain why, but Marcus reminded him of people who had learned patience through years of disciplined practice rather than natural confidence. Nearby, Correctional Officer Daniel Foster observed the dining hall from his assigned position beside the south entrance. He noticed Kyle turning toward the newcomer and instinctively paid closer attention. Experience had taught him that trouble often announced itself through body language long before anyone broke a rule. Marcus finally reached an empty table near the windows overlooking the recreation yard. Before he could set down his tray, Kyle casually stepped into his path with the coffee cup still resting comfortably in one hand. The cafeteria gradually became quieter. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Kyle smiled as though greeting an old friend. First day, Marcus met his eyes politely. Yes, you are going to learn things work differently around here. Marcus nodded once. Every place has its own routine. Kyle took another slow step closer. You catch on fast. Without another word, he tilted the paper cup. Warm coffee splashed across the front of Marcus's orange prison jumpsuit, leaving dark stains running down the fabric before dripping onto the polished concrete floor. A few scattered laughs echoed through the cafeteria, but they faded almost as quickly. As they began, everyone expected the newcomer to react with anger, embarrassment, or frustration. Marcus simply looked down at the coffee soaking into the front of his uniform. He carefully placed his tray on the nearby table before removing a folded napkin from beside the plastic utensils. With slow, deliberate movements, he gently wiped the remaining coffee from his hands and sleeves without saying a single word. Kyle folded his arms, waiting for an argument that never came. Marcus finished cleaning the stain as much as possible, looked back toward Kyle, and offered a calm expression that carried neither resentment nor fear. I hope you did not burn your hand holding the cup, he said quietly. The unexpected response erased every remaining sound inside the cafeteria. Walter Hayes slowly leaned back in his chair, unable to hide his surprise. Officer Foster narrowed his eyes, sensing that something about the new inmate did not fit the pattern he had witnessed countless times before. Kyle stared at Marcus for several long seconds, searching for embarrassment, anger, or defiance, but found only patience. Around the cafeteria, inmates exchanged uncertain glances as the ordinary lunchtime routine disappeared beneath an unfamiliar feeling. Nobody could explain why one simple sentence had changed the atmosphere so completely, but everyone sensed they had just witnessed the beginning of a story that would soon spread through every corner of Redwood State Correctional Facility. The cafeteria remained unusually quiet long after the coffee had disappeared into the fabric of Marcus Reed's orange prison jumpsuit. Most inmates expected the new arrival to answer humiliation with anger, but the calm black inmate simply picked up his lunch tray and sat alone near the window, as though nothing unusual had happened. The silence surrounding him became far more uncomfortable than shouting ever could have been. Around the room, conversations slowly returned, yet almost every inmate continued stealing quick glances toward the newcomer. Kyle Donovan remained standing for another moment before returning to his own table. His followers laughed again, although the laughter sounded forced this time. Something about Marcus's response had unsettled them. Instead of watching a frightened newcomer lose control, they had witnessed a man who seemed completely unaffected by public embarrassment. Kyle took a sip from another cup of coffee placed in front of him and leaned back in his chair. "He will learn," he said confidently. Several white inmates nodded in agreement, but none sounded entirely convinced. Across the cafeteria, Marcus quietly unfolded his napkin, arranged his meal neatly on the tray, and began eating with the same calm rhythm he had carried from the moment he entered the room. He neither rushed nor looked around to measure other people's reactions. Every movement appeared deliberate, almost routine. Walter Hayes watched from 2 tables away while slowly shaking his head. During nearly 2 decades inside different correctional facilities, he had seen confident men, frightened men, reckless men, and stubborn men. Marcus did not resemble any of them. He carried himself with the quiet patience of someone who understood that every action created a consequence, even the smallest one. Walter finally stood, carried his tray across the cafeteria, and stopped beside Marcus's table. "Mind if I sit here?" Marcus looked up with a polite smile. "Please." Walter lowered himself into the chair across from him and remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. Most new inmates spend their first meal trying not to attract attention. Marcus nodded slightly. "Sometimes attention finds people anyway." Walter smiled faintly. "That is true." They continued eating quietly for another minute before Walter asked, "Does what happened bother you?" Marcus set down his plastic fork and answered honestly, "The coffee will wash out. Holding on to anger usually takes longer." Walter studied him carefully. The answer sounded sincere rather than rehearsed. "You have handled difficult people before." Marcus looked briefly toward the cafeteria windows where afternoon sunlight reflected across the recreation yard outside. "Everyone has." Walter noticed that Marcus never claimed to be different from anyone else. Every answer remained simple, respectful, and impossible to argue with. Nearby, Correctional Officer Daniel Foster continued observing the dining hall while quietly making notes on a small clipboard. He had expected paperwork after the incident, yet Marcus had neither complained nor requested assistance. Officially, there was little for Foster to document beyond a minor disturbance. Still, the officer found himself watching Marcus more closely than any other inmate in the room. The newcomer's posture remained relaxed, but his awareness extended far beyond the food in front of him. Without turning his head, Marcus seemed to recognize every correctional officer moving through the cafeteria, every tray returning to the serving line, and every conversation growing louder or quieter nearby. Foster had worked inside prisons long enough to recognize situational awareness when he saw it. Most people develop that skill only after many years in difficult environments. As lunch ended, inmates began carrying their trays toward the collection station. Marcus carefully stacked his utensils, wiped the remaining drops of coffee from the edge of the table, and returned his tray without leaving a mess behind. Kyle noticed the small gesture from across the room and frowned. It felt as though every attempt to unsettle the newcomer had produced the opposite result. Instead of appearing weak, Marcus somehow looked more composed with each passing minute. The correctional officer assigned to the housing unit called for inmates to line up. Rows quickly formed across the cafeteria floor. Marcus quietly joined the end of the line without attempting to move ahead or avoid anyone. Walter remained a few places behind him, while Kyle stood farther forward with the inmates who usually surrounded him. As the line slowly advanced toward the exit, Kyle glanced over his shoulder. "Still wearing that coffee?" he asked with a faint smile. Marcus looked down at the stain on his uniform before answering. "It reminds me that every day gives us another chance to choose who we want to become." The hallway outside the cafeteria fell silent again. Several inmates exchanged puzzled looks, while others simply stared at Marcus without speaking. Daniel Foster heard the answer as he held the security door open and quietly wondered what kind of life had taught a man to answer repeated insults with unwavering patience. Kyle turned forward without another word. But for the first time since Marcus entered Redwood State Correctional Facility, uncertainty quietly replaced certainty inside his own mind. And although nobody recognized it yet, that single moment marked the beginning of a change neither man could have predicted. The afternoon passed slowly inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, but the story of what happened in the cafeteria traveled much faster than any inmate walking through the concrete corridors. By the time the housing units reopened after the meal, nearly everyone had heard some version of the encounter between the quiet new inmate and Kyle Donovan. Some claimed the newcomer had been too frightened to react. Others insisted he had remained calm because he simply did not care what anyone thought. A handful of longtime inmates believed something entirely different. Walter Hayes belonged to that last group. He walked beside Marcus Reed as the inmates returned to cell block C, where heavy steel doors echoed through the corridor and fluorescent lights cast pale reflections across the polished concrete floor. Marcus carried himself exactly as he had earlier in the cafeteria. The coffee stain remained visible across the front of his orange prison jumpsuit, but he seemed completely unconcerned by it. He observed the housing unit with quiet attention, occasionally looking toward the officer stations, the stairwells leading to the upper tier, and the rows of identical cells stretching in both directions. Walter finally broke the silence. Most people would have spent the last hour talking about getting even. Marcus smiled faintly without slowing his pace. Getting even usually creates another reason to keep score. Walter chuckled softly. "You have an answer for everything." Marcus shook his head. "Not everything. I have simply learned that every problem does not deserve the same response." Walter studied him for another moment before asking, "What did you do before coming here?" Marcus looked ahead at the long corridor. "I coached young people for several years." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Sports?" Marcus nodded once. "Something like that." He offered nothing more, and Walter recognized that the conversation had reached a natural stopping point. Marcus never sounded secretive. He simply answered only what he truly wanted to answer. From the second-floor railing above, Kyle Donovan quietly watched the two men walking together. He had expected Marcus to become isolated after lunch, yet the opposite seemed to be happening. A respected longtime inmate had chosen to walk beside him without hesitation. That small detail irritated Kyle far more than the conversation in the cafeteria. Respect inside prison rarely appeared overnight, but curiosity often became the first step toward it. Kyle had no intention of allowing that process to continue. Nearby, Correctional Officer Daniel Foster completed a routine inspection before pausing beside the control station. Another officer glanced toward Marcus and quietly asked, "That is the new inmate everyone has been talking about?" Foster nodded. He handled himself differently than most people would. Different how? Foster thought carefully before answering. He never looked surprised. He never looked offended. He paid attention to everything around him without making it obvious. The other officer looked toward Marcus, who had stopped briefly beside the bulletin board to read the weekly recreation schedule before continuing toward his assigned cell. "Military," the officer guessed. Foster slowly shook his head. "Maybe. Maybe not. Whatever it is, he has unusual discipline." Inside cell C, 214, Marcus folded his extra uniform neatly, cleaned the remaining coffee stain as thoroughly as possible with the limited supplies available, and placed a worn paperback book on the small metal shelf beside his bunk. His cell contained almost nothing beyond the standard furnishings issued to every inmate, yet everything rested in careful order. He sat quietly on the edge of the bunk for several minutes. listening to the distant sounds of doors closing, conversations fading through the corridor, and the rhythmic announcements echoing over the public address system. Across the housing unit, Kyle continued thinking about the afternoon. Every previous attempt to establish control over a newcomer had ended quickly. Marcus had somehow changed the outcome without arguing, threatening anyone, or seeking help from correctional officers. That calm confidence felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things often became dangerous inside prison. Kyle finally stood and looked toward two inmates who usually followed his lead. "Keep an eye on him," he said calmly. "I want to know where he goes, who he talks to, and what he does." The two men nodded without asking questions. Meanwhile, Walter paused outside Marcus's cell before evening count. "One piece of advice," he said quietly. "People here are going to keep testing you because they cannot figure you out." Marcus looked up from his book with the same calm expression he had carried all day. People usually stop testing others once they understand themselves a little better. Walter smiled as he walked away, realizing that Marcus had once again answered without judgment or resentment. As the lights dimmed slightly to signal the beginning of evening count, Daniel Foster completed one final walk through the housing unit. He glanced toward Marcus's cell and noticed the newcomer sitting peacefully with a book while nearly everyone else watched television or argued across the corridor. Foster made no comment, but a quiet question continued forming in his mind. He had seen confidence before. He had seen patience before. What he had never seen was someone whose self-control remained completely unchanged regardless of who stood in front of him. And that unanswered question would soon lead more than one person inside Redwood to wonder what kind of life could shape a man like Marcus Reed. Morning sunlight filtered through the narrow, reinforced windows as another day began inside Redwood State Correctional Facility. Steel doors opened one after another with their familiar metallic rhythm, and inmates slowly stepped into the corridor for breakfast count. Marcus Reed emerged from cell C, 214, wearing a freshly cleaned orange prison jumpsuit. The coffee stain from the previous afternoon had disappeared, leaving no visible reminder of what had happened in the cafeteria. Yet the memory itself had spread throughout the prison far more effectively than any stain could have. As Marcus joined the orderly line, conversations softened around him. Some inmates looked away when he noticed them watching. Others studied him openly, trying to understand why the newest black inmate seemed completely untouched by the attention surrounding him. Marcus acknowledged no one differently than anyone else. He simply greeted a correctional officer with a polite nod before quietly taking his place in line. Walter Hayes stepped in behind him and smiled. "Looks like everybody knows your name already." Marcus answered with a calm expression. "Names travel faster than people." Walter laughed quietly. "That they do." Across the corridor, Kyle Donovan leaned against the railing outside his second-tier cell, silently observing the exchange below. His confidence had returned overnight, but so had his determination. He had spent years maintaining influence inside cell block C, and he refused to let a newcomer quietly reshape the atmosphere around him. Two inmates standing nearby looked toward Marcus before glancing back at Kyle. One asked, "Want us to handle it?" Kyle slowly shook his head. "Not yet. I want to understand him first." That answer surprised both men. Kyle rarely showed patience. His decisions usually came quickly and publicly. This time, however, curiosity had begun replacing certainty. During breakfast, Marcus selected a simple meal, thanked the kitchen workers serving the trays, and sat alone at a table near the edge of the dining hall. He opened a small paperback book while eating, occasionally turning a page between bites without appearing distracted by the constant movement around him. Officer Daniel Foster noticed the routine immediately. The same careful posture, the same measured pace, the same awareness of everyone entering and leaving the cafeteria. Foster quietly remarked to another officer, "Watch his eyes." The younger officer looked confused. "What about them?" Foster answered softly. "He never stares, but he never misses anything. Either." Meanwhile, Kyle entered the cafeteria with several white inmates following closely behind. Instead of walking directly toward Marcus, he chose a nearby table where he could observe without appearing interested. For several minutes, he simply watched. Marcus finished one chapter, closed the book, and looked through the cafeteria windows toward the recreation yard where maintenance workers prepared equipment for the afternoon schedule. His expression remained thoughtful rather than guarded. Kyle frowned. Every other newcomer eventually reacted to constant attention. Marcus behaved as though he had already accepted that people would watch him and saw no reason to change because of it. After breakfast, inmates were assigned to their daily work details. Marcus reported to the prison library, where shelves filled with donated books lined the quiet room. The assignment suited him perfectly. He carefully organized returned books, repaired worn bindings with approved supplies, and helped another inmate locate a history book without drawing attention to himself. Librarian supervisor Ellen Brooks observed his work from behind the circulation desk and quietly commented to a nearby correctional officer. "He treats every book like it belongs to someone he respects." The officer smiled. "Not something we see every day." Marcus simply continued working, unaware that even ordinary moments were slowly changing how people viewed him. Later that afternoon, the library doors opened again as several inmates entered to exchange books before recreation time. Walter stopped by to return a novel and greeted Marcus with a friendly wave. A few minutes later, Kyle unexpectedly appeared in the doorway. The room became noticeably quieter. Rather than approaching immediately, Kyle slowly walked between the shelves, pretending to examine book titles while occasionally glancing toward Marcus. The library was one of the few places inside Redwood where loud voices rarely interrupted the silence, making every small movement feel more significant. Marcus continued arranging books without looking up until Kyle finally stopped beside the return cart. "You really like spending time with books," Kyle said. Marcus placed another volume neatly onto the shelf before answering. "They reward patience." Kyle folded his arms. "You always talk like that." Marcus smiled politely. "Only when someone asks." A faint smile briefly crossed Walter's face from the opposite side of the room. Even Kyle seemed uncertain how to continue. Every attempt to provoke Marcus dissolved into ordinary conversation before it could become conflict. Watching from the circulation desk, Ellen Brooks quietly realized she was witnessing something unusual. The quiet newcomer was changing the emotional temperature of every room he entered, not by demanding respect, but simply by refusing to surrender his own self-control. As the afternoon recreation announcement echoed through the library speakers, inmates began lining up to leave. Kyle looked at Marcus one final time before turning toward the exit. Deep inside, he had reached an important conclusion. If patience could not break the new inmate, then sooner or later he would have to create a situation that demanded a visible response. Never realizing that the greatest surprise waiting inside Redwood State Correctional Facility would not come from anger, but from extraordinary discipline hidden beneath remarkable humility. The afternoon recreation period arrived beneath a clear blue sky, and inmates gradually filled the concrete yard surrounded by tall security fences and watchtowers. Groups gathered around the basketball court. Others claimed familiar benches, while a steady line circled the walking track. Marcus Reed stepped into the yard carrying the same paperback book he had borrowed from the library earlier that morning. He paused for a moment, quietly taking in the surroundings before choosing an empty bench beneath a large maple tree near the perimeter fence. The location offered shade, a clear view of the yard, and enough distance from the louder conversations taking place near the basketball court. He sat down, opened the book, and resumed reading as though he had entered a quiet public park rather than one of the busiest areas inside Redwood State Correctional Facility. Across the yard, Kyle Donovan noticed him almost immediately. The white inmate stood with several companions near the weight exercise area, watching Marcus from a distance. One of the men beside him asked, "He really spends all his time reading?" Kyle nodded slowly. "That is exactly why nobody understands him." Another inmate shrugged. "Maybe he really is just quiet." Kyle never answered. Something about Marcus continued to bother him in ways he could not explain. Every attempt to make the newcomer uncomfortable had somehow strengthened the respect others quietly began showing him. Kyle had built his reputation on reading people quickly, yet Marcus remained impossible to predict. Walter Hayes walked several laps around the recreation track before stopping beside Marcus's bench. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" Marcus looked up with a friendly smile and closed the book. "Please." Walter sat beside him, stretching his legs comfortably. "You know, people have been talking about you since yesterday." Marcus smiled faintly. "People usually become curious before they become familiar." Walter laughed. "You always find a peaceful way to answer." Marcus looked toward the basketball court where several inmates applauded after a successful shot. "Life gives us enough conflict without adding more." Before Walter could respond, a basketball rolled across the yard and came to rest several feet from the bench. A younger inmate hurried over, picked it up, and thanked Marcus with a respectful nod. Marcus simply wished him a good game before returning his attention to the conversation. Walter quietly noticed that even small interactions seemed effortless for him. He never tried to impress anyone, yet people naturally responded with courtesy. Nearby, Correctional Officer Daniel Foster observed the exchange from the walking path. He had begun paying closer attention to Marcus over the past day, partly because of the cafeteria incident and partly because experienced officers often trusted patterns more than first impressions. The pattern surrounding Marcus remained unusually consistent. Calm speech, measured movements, quiet awareness, respect shown even to people who ignored him. Foster found himself wondering what experiences had shaped that level of discipline. Meanwhile, Kyle made a decision. He walked across the recreation yard alone while his companions remained behind, curious to see what would happen next. As he approached the bench, nearby conversations gradually softened. Inmates noticed his direction and instinctively turned their attention toward the quiet corner beneath the maple tree. Walter recognized Kyle immediately and slowly stood. Marcus remained seated for another moment before calmly closing his book and placing it beside him. Kyle stopped several feet away with his hands resting comfortably at his sides. "Looks like you finally found a place you like," he said. Marcus nodded politely. "It is peaceful here." Kyle glanced toward the book. "You spend more time with that than with people," Marcus answered gently. "Books usually encourage people to think." A few inmates standing nearby exchanged amused smiles. Kyle folded his arms. "You always stay this calm?" Marcus considered the question before replying. "Staying calm helps me make better decisions." Kyle took one slow step closer. "You really believe patience solves everything?" Marcus looked directly at him without the slightest trace of irritation. "Not everything. But impatience usually creates problems that never needed to exist." The answer lingered in the quiet afternoon air. Walter remained standing a respectful distance away, carefully watching both men. Officer Foster also slowed his patrol, sensing that another important moment might be unfolding. Kyle searched Marcus's face for even the smallest sign of frustration, but found none. The newcomer's expression remained composed, confident, and sincere. For reasons he could not explain, Kyle suddenly realized he had spent 2 full days trying to change another man's behavior without noticing that his own behavior had begun changing instead. Rather than acting on impulse, he now found himself studying Marcus, asking questions, and searching for answers. Around the recreation yard, several inmates quietly returned to their activities, although many continued looking back toward the bench from time to time. The atmosphere had changed again, not because of threats or confrontation, but because the quiet newcomer continued demonstrating that self-control could influence an entire room more effectively than intimidation ever could. And although nobody yet knew the full story behind Marcus Reed's remarkable discipline, more people inside Redwood were beginning to believe that his past contained lessons far greater than anyone had imagined. The quiet conversation beneath the maple tree ended when the loudspeaker announced the final 20 minutes of afternoon recreation. Around the yard, inmates slowly drifted toward different activities while correctional officers continued their routine patrols along the concrete walkways. Marcus Reed picked up his paperback book, brushed a few fallen leaves from its cover, and stood with the same calm posture he had shown since arriving at Redwood State Correctional Facility. Walter Hayes smiled before heading toward the walking track, leaving Marcus alone on the bench once again. From across the yard, Kyle Donovan continued watching. He had expected frustration, pride, or even hidden anger to appear by now, yet none of those emotions ever surfaced. Instead, the quiet black inmate seemed completely comfortable allowing every misunderstanding to exist without correcting it. That puzzled Kyle more than any direct challenge ever could. Near the basketball court, a younger inmate hurried backward while trying to catch an errant pass. Without noticing where he was stepping, he nearly collided with another inmate carrying a tray of bottled water from the recreation station. Several people instinctively tensed, expecting an argument to erupt from the unexpected contact. Before either man could lose balance, Marcus took 2 calm steps forward and gently guided one of the bottles before it slipped from the tray, allowing both inmates to steady themselves without spilling anything. The movement lasted barely a second. It was smooth, controlled, and so effortless that most people assumed it had happened by chance. Marcus simply handed the bottle back with a polite smile. "Looks like everyone is all right," he said. Both inmates thanked him before continuing on their way. Walter, who had turned just in time to witness the moment, narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Officer Daniel Foster had also seen it from less than 30 feet away. He quietly replayed the brief movement in his mind. Marcus had not rushed. He had not reached awkwardly. Every step appeared perfectly balanced, arriving at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Foster had spent years watching people react under pressure, and very few moved with that level of natural coordination. Kyle noticed the same thing. Although the incident seemed insignificant, something about Marcus's timing felt unusually refined. It was not the action itself that stood out. It was the complete absence of wasted motion. Marcus returned to the bench as though nothing remarkable had happened and reopened his book. A gentle breeze carried the sound of distant conversations across the yard, while sunlight reflected from the razor wire surrounding the prison grounds. Everything seemed ordinary again. Yet several inmates quietly exchanged curious glances. One man whispered, "Did you see how he caught that?" Another shrugged. "Maybe he got lucky." Walter smiled to himself without joining the discussion. Deep inside, he no longer believed luck explained anything about Marcus Reed. As recreation period came to an end, inmates formed orderly lines for the walk back toward their housing units. Marcus waited patiently until those ahead of him began moving before taking his place near the middle of the line. Kyle deliberately stepped into the same line a short distance away. Neither man spoke for several minutes as heavy security gates opened one after another with their familiar metallic echo. Finally, Kyle glanced sideways. "You always seem to be exactly where you need to be." Marcus looked ahead toward the next checkpoint before answering. "Paying attention helps." Kyle gave a faint smile. "There is more to it than that." Marcus remained quiet for a moment. "Most skills begin with paying attention." The answer lingered between them as they continued walking through the corridor. Officer Foster, escorting the line from behind, heard every word. The simplicity of Marcus's response only deepened his curiosity. Later that evening, after count had been completed and the housing unit settled into its quieter routine, Foster stopped briefly outside the administrative office. He remembered a conversation from years earlier with a volunteer athletic coach who had visited the facility to mentor young offenders. The coach had once said that truly disciplined competitors rarely needed to prove themselves because years of training taught them that confidence did not depend on recognition. The memory returned unexpectedly as Foster thought about Marcus. He quietly opened the inmate database on a secure computer, not searching for trouble, but for understanding. The basic intake information revealed very little beyond ordinary records, yet one note attached to previous community service programs caught his attention. It referenced years of competitive martial arts instruction before Marcus's incarceration. Foster leaned back thoughtfully without opening any additional restricted files. Suddenly, the newcomer's balance, timing, patience, and extraordinary self-control no longer seemed mysterious. They reflected years of disciplined practice dedicated not to intimidation, but to precision, respect, and restraint. Back inside cell C-214, Marcus closed his paperback book, placed it carefully beside his bunk, and looked through the narrow window toward the fading evening sky. Beyond the steel bars, the last light of the day slowly disappeared, while elsewhere inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, quiet questions continued spreading from one conversation to another. For the first time since Marcus arrived, people had begun looking beyond the calm man they could see and wondering about the remarkable life experience that had shaped him into someone whose greatest strength was not how he moved, but how consistently he chose patience over pride. The following afternoon brought another recreation period, and by then the quiet confidence surrounding Marcus Reed had become one of the most discussed topics inside Redwood State Correctional Facility. Nobody could explain why the newest inmate remained so composed under constant attention, yet more people than ever found themselves watching him instead of the man who had once commanded every conversation in the yard. Marcus walked along the recreation track at an easy pace with a paperback book tucked beneath one arm, occasionally stopping to appreciate the warm sunlight filtering through the tall security fences before continuing toward the same maple tree where he had spent the previous afternoon. Walter Hayes greeted him with a friendly wave from across the yard, while Officer Daniel Foster quietly noted the familiar routine from his patrol route. Everything about Marcus remained remarkably consistent. He greeted people politely, thanked a maintenance worker who moved equipment out of the walkway, and chose the same bench beneath the shade without appearing to notice how many eyes followed him. Carl Donovan noticed as well. For nearly 3 days he had searched for cracks in the newcomer's calm demeanor, yet every attempt had produced the opposite effect. More inmates now greeted Marcus respectfully, not because he demanded attention, but because he never seemed interested in controlling anyone around him. Carl finally walked across the yard alone. His usual companions remained several yards behind, curious but cautious. Walter recognized Kyle's approach and quietly stood from the nearby bench, deciding to remain close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid interfering. Marcus closed his book as Kyle stopped a comfortable distance in front of him. Neither man spoke immediately. The afternoon breeze carried distant laughter from the basketball court, while correctional officers continued their normal patrols along the concrete path. Kyle finally broke the silence. "I have been trying to figure you out since your first day." Marcus smiled politely. "Have you found an answer?" Kyle slowly shook his head. "No. Every time I think I understand you, you surprise me again." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "People are usually more complicated than first impressions." Kyle folded his arms. "You never get angry. You never try to prove yourself. You never seem worried about what anybody thinks." Marcus looked toward the recreation yard before answering. "Other people's opinions change. Every day, character changes much more slowly." Walter quietly smiled to himself. Officer Foster, now walking nearby, slowed his pace just enough to hear the conversation without interrupting it. Kyle remained silent for several moments before asking another question. "Where did you learn that kind of discipline?" Marcus rested the book on the bench beside him. "I spent many years training in Taekwondo." The words were spoken without pride, almost as naturally as someone mentioning an old hobby. Kyle raised an eyebrow. "Training?" Marcus nodded once. "For a long time. Were you good?" Marcus gave a modest smile. "I always tried to improve." Before the conversation could continue, a recreation coordinator carrying a box of sports equipment approached the basketball court. One of the lightweight practice targets slipped from the top of the stack and bounced across the pavement. Marcus instinctively stepped forward, caught the soft foam target before it rolled beneath another inmate's feet, and handed it back with a friendly smile. The entire motion looked effortless, balanced, and controlled. The recreation coordinator thanked him warmly and continued setting up the afternoon activities. Foster noticed the movement immediately. It was not flashy. It was simply precise. Kyle noticed it as well, remembering every small moment over the past several days when Marcus's timing had seemed almost impossible to disturb. "That was not luck, was it?" Kyle asked quietly after the coordinator walked away. Marcus looked back toward him with the same calm expression. Years of practice teach people to pay attention before they react. Kyle studied him carefully. "So the stories are true." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "What stories?" "People are saying you competed before you came here." Marcus remained silent for a brief moment before answering honestly. "I competed for many years. I was fortunate to win some important tournaments. Those experiences taught me discipline, respect, and self-control. They matter much more than medals." Walter's eyes widened slightly, and even Officer Foster found himself quietly impressed by the absence of ego in Marcus's voice. Most people would have listed titles or accomplishments. Marcus spoke only about the lessons he carried forward. Kyle slowly lowered his arms. The frustration that had driven him since the cafeteria seemed to fade, replaced by genuine understanding. "I thought staying quiet meant you were afraid," he admitted. Marcus shook his head gently. "Sometimes staying quiet simply means someone has already learned that peace is stronger than pride." Neither man spoke again for several seconds. Around them, the recreation yard continued with its ordinary afternoon routine, yet something invisible had changed. The tension that had once surrounded every meeting between them quietly disappeared, replaced by mutual respect earned not through intimidation, but through patience, humility, and years of disciplined character that no public reputation could ever equal. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside Redwood State Correctional Facility had changed in subtle ways that could not be measured by official reports or written into daily logs. The change could only be seen in the small moments that defined prison life. Conversations paused when Marcus Reed entered a room, not because people feared him, but because they had become curious about the quiet man who never seemed interested in proving himself. During breakfast, inmates who had ignored him only days earlier now greeted him with respectful nods. In the library, more people asked for his recommendations on books, discovering that he listened more carefully than he spoke. Even correctional officers noticed that disagreements near Marcus often settled more quickly simply because his calm presence encouraged others to lower their voices. Officer Daniel Foster continued thinking about the conversation from the recreation yard. After completing his evening responsibilities, he requested permission to review the publicly available sections of Marcus's educational and community program records. The documents confirmed what Marcus had quietly admitted without exaggeration. Years before arriving at Redwood, he had earned recognition through competitive Taekwondo, volunteered at youth sports programs, and spent countless hours mentoring teenagers about discipline, responsibility, and respect. There was no dramatic headline, no extraordinary mystery, only years of patient work that reflected exactly the person Marcus appeared to be every day inside the prison. Foster closed the file with a thoughtful expression. For the first time in many years, he found himself reflecting on how easily appearances could mislead even experienced professionals. Across the housing unit, Walter Hayes smiled as he watched Marcus return another finished novel to the library cart before selecting a different book for the evening. "You have changed this place without trying," Walter said quietly. Marcus looked up with a modest smile. "People change themselves. Sometimes they only need a different example." Walter nodded slowly. Most people never realize that. Nearby, Kyle Donovan stood silently for several moments before walking toward Marcus. Several inmates noticed the approach and instinctively looked up, remembering the tension that had surrounded the two men only a few days earlier. This time, however, Kyle stopped at a respectful distance. "I owe you something," he said. Marcus closed the book in his hands and gave him his full attention. "You do not owe me anything." Kyle shook his head. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I thought patience meant weakness." Marcus answered gently. "Many people make quick decisions. What matters is what they choose after learning more." Kyle gave a quiet nod. "You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone." Marcus smiled faintly. Winning respect has always mattered more than winning arguments. The words lingered in the quiet corridor. Around them, several inmates exchanged thoughtful glances, realizing they were witnessing something unusual. Instead of another rivalry growing stronger, they were watching understanding replace assumption. During the following recreation period, the same maple tree that had become Marcus's favorite reading spot looked different. Walter joined him with another paperback novel, while Kyle chose a nearby bench without trying to control the conversation around him. Other inmates continued their games, walked the track, or simply enjoyed the afternoon sunlight, yet the tension that once surrounded the area had disappeared. Officer Foster watched from the walkway and quietly smiled to himself. Redwood had not become a perfect place overnight, but one person's consistent example had reminded everyone that dignity, patience, and self-control could influence others more effectively than intimidation ever could. As the evening sun settled behind the prison walls, Marcus closed his book and looked briefly toward the fading light beyond the security fence. He understood that every person carried a story invisible to everyone else. Some stories were filled with victories, others with mistakes, but every new day offered another opportunity to choose wisdom over pride. Around him, the ordinary sounds of prison life continued exactly as before, yet the people hearing those sounds had changed. The newcomer who had quietly walked into the cafeteria wearing a stained orange prison jumpsuit had never tried to become the strongest voice inside Redwood State Correctional Facility. Instead, through humility, discipline, and unwavering respect for others, he had become something far more enduring. A reminder that true strength is measured not by the ability to overpower another person, but by the character to remain steady when every reason exists to do otherwise. Several weeks passed, and the rhythm of life inside Redwood State Correctional Facility settled into something quietly different. The walls, the steel doors, and the daily schedules remained exactly the same, yet the atmosphere among the inmates had changed in ways that no official report could ever fully describe. Marcus Reed continued following the same routine every day. He reported to the library on time, greeted correctional officers with courtesy, helped organize donated books, and spent his recreation periods beneath the familiar maple tree with another paperback resting in his hands. He never spoke about tournaments, never mentioned medals, and never reminded anyone of the years he had devoted to Taekwondo. For Marcus, those achievements belonged to the past. What mattered now was the person he chose to become each new day. Walter Hayes often joined him during afternoon recreation, and their conversations became one of the quiet traditions of the yard. They discussed history, biographies, personal responsibility, and the importance of learning from mistakes rather than allowing mistakes to define an entire life. Other inmates occasionally sat nearby, not to interrupt, but simply to listen. Marcus never lectured anyone. He answered questions honestly, encouraged people to think for themselves, and believed that respect could never be forced. It had to be earned through consistent actions. Officer Daniel Foster noticed another unexpected change as the weeks continued. Minor disagreements inside cell block C became easier to resolve. Inmates who once competed for attention now spent more time speaking calmly with one another. Kyle Donovan no longer searched for opportunities to embarrass newcomers during meal times. Instead, he quietly observed the people entering the housing unit, occasionally offering practical advice that helped them avoid unnecessary trouble. Foster understood that nobody had ordered these changes. They had developed naturally because one person's example had slowly influenced everyone around him. One afternoon, the prison recreation department announced a voluntary wellness program designed to encourage physical fitness and positive habits. Several inmates signed up without much enthusiasm, expecting another routine activity that would soon disappear. To everyone's surprise, the recreation coordinator approached Marcus and asked whether he would be willing to demonstrate basic stretching, balance, and breathing exercises that anyone could safely practice. Marcus accepted only after making one condition clear. "Everyone participates as equals," he said quietly. "Nobody is here to impress anyone else." The coordinator smiled. "That is exactly what we hoped you would say." During the first session, Marcus stood before a small group of inmates wearing the same orange prison jumpsuit as everyone else. There were no trophies, no introductions celebrating past accomplishments, and no special treatment. He simply demonstrated careful posture, controlled breathing, patient focus, and the importance of discipline that extended beyond physical movement. He explained that real confidence grew from consistency rather than applause, and that every worthwhile skill required humility long before it produced success. Even those who had never considered martial arts found themselves listening closely because the lessons reached far beyond exercise. Kyle attended every session without missing one. At the end of the final class, he quietly approached Marcus after the others had returned to their housing units. "I spent years believing respect came from making people afraid," Kyle admitted. Marcus looked toward the empty recreation yard before answering. "Fear disappears quickly. Character stays with you much longer." Kyle slowly nodded. "I wish I had understood that sooner." Marcus offered a warm smile. "Understanding today is still better than never understanding at all." As the evening sun settled behind the tall security fences, Officer Foster completed one final walk through the recreation yard before the inmates returned inside. He paused beneath the maple tree where Marcus had spent so many afternoons reading quietly. Looking across the peaceful yard, Foster realized that the most remarkable people were often the ones who never tried to appear remarkable. Marcus had arrived carrying nothing more than a small bag of personal belongings and years of quiet discipline. He had faced public humiliation with patience, answered disrespect with dignity, and transformed assumptions into admiration without raising his voice or demanding recognition. Inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, many stories would eventually be forgotten as inmates transferred, officers retired, and seasons changed. Yet one story continued to endure because it reminded everyone who heard it that appearances rarely reveal the full truth about another person. The quiet newcomer who had once walked through the cafeteria with coffee, soaking his prison uniform, never became respected because he had been a champion. He became respected because, long before anyone discovered his achievements, he had already chosen humility over pride, patience over anger, and character over reputation. In the end, those choices became the greatest victory of all, leaving behind a lesson that would continue echoing through Redwood long after every conversation about medals, titles, and first impressions had finally faded away.